I moved into the apartment on the third floor of an old brick building in October, mostly because it was cheap and close enough to my job that I could walk there in about 15 minutes. The building had 4 floors, 2 apartments on each side of every hallway, and a narrow staircase that always smelled faintly of dust and cooking oil. Nothing about the place seemed particularly strange when I first saw it. The landlord was an older man named Mr. Harris who spoke quickly, kept his keys on a giant metal ring, and seemed more interested in finding someone to sign the lease than showing me around. He told me the walls were thick, the neighborhood was quiet, and the previous tenant had stayed for almost 4 years. I remember asking why he had left, and Mr. Harris shrugged and said, "Bought a house, I think." That was all. I moved in on a Saturday, spent most of the afternoon carrying boxes upstairs, and didn't really meet any of my neighbors until that evening. The first person I saw was a woman from the apartment directly across the hall. She was probably in her late 30s, with dark hair tied behind her head and a tired expression that made her look like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. She stepped out while I was struggling with a box of books. "You must be the new guy," she said. "Yeah, just moved in." "I'm Claire." "3B?" She pointed across the hallway. "I'm Daniel." "3A?" She smiled briefly, then looked toward my apartment door. "If you hear noises at night, don't worry about it." I laughed because I assumed she was joking. "What kind of noises?" Her expression changed slightly. "Pipes. This building makes a lot of noise." Before I could answer, she went back inside. I didn't think much about it. Old buildings creak. Pipes bang. People walk around. That's normal. For the first week, everything was normal. I went to work, came home, cooked simple meals, watched television, and slowly unpacked. Claire was usually quiet. Sometimes I'd see her leaving for work in the morning and we'd exchange a quick hello. I noticed she never had visitors, at least none that I saw. She also seemed to spend very little time in the hallway. One Thursday night, around 1:30 in the morning, I woke up to 3 soft knocks. Knock, knock, knock. I sat up in bed and listened. Nothing followed. I assumed it had come from the hallway, so I checked my phone and went back to sleep. The following night it happened again. 3 knocks, almost exactly the same. This time they sounded closer, like they were coming from the wall beside my bed. I got up, pressed my ear against the wall, and heard nothing. I figured it was plumbing or someone moving furniture. The next morning I mentioned it to Claire when I saw her. She stopped walking. "3 knocks?" she asked. "Yeah, around 1:30. She stared at me for a second longer than felt normal. Probably the pipes. Then she walked away. That was the first moment I started wondering if she had known exactly what I was talking about. Over the next few nights, the knocking continued. Always 3 knocks. Sometimes at 1:20. Sometimes at 1:40, never more than 3. I began sleeping with the television on because the silence made me notice every little sound. Then, one night I heard something different. It was about 2:15 a.m. when I woke up to the sound of someone walking in my apartment. At first I thought I was dreaming. I could hear slow footsteps moving across the living room floor. One step. Then another. Then another. I stayed completely still in bed, trying to convince myself it was coming from the apartment above me. But the footsteps had a strange clarity to them. They seemed to be directly outside my bedroom. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The bedroom door was open about 6 inches. I always slept with it closed. I remember staring at that gap for several seconds before finally getting out of bed. I checked the living room, kitchen, bathroom, and front door. Everything was locked. Nothing was missing. There was no one inside. I blamed myself for forgetting to close the bedroom door. The next morning, I went to work and tried not to think about it. That evening, however, I found something that made me uncomfortable. There were faint, muddy footprints on the floor near my front door. They were small, almost like someone had stepped inside wearing wet shoes and then wiped their feet before walking farther into the apartment. I hadn't been outside since coming home the previous night, and I lived alone. I cleaned them up and told myself someone must have tracked mud into the hallway and I had somehow brought it inside. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. The following night I stayed awake until after midnight. Nothing happened. At 1:17 I heard the 3 knocks again. This time they weren't coming from the wall beside my bed. They were coming from my front door. I froze. Knock, knock, knock. I didn't move. A few seconds passed. Then I heard a quiet scrape against the bottom of the door. It sounded like something thin being dragged across the floor. I grabbed my phone and opened the camera, but before I could reach the door, I heard footsteps moving away down the hallway. I looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I opened my door a few inches and looked both ways. Nothing. Then I noticed something on the floor. A folded piece of paper had been pushed underneath my door. I picked it up and unfolded it. There were 4 words written in black pen. "Don't answer her again." I stood there staring at the message for several seconds. I immediately thought of Claire. I knocked on her door. No answer. I knocked again. Still nothing. I went back inside and locked my door. About 10 minutes later, I heard her door open. I looked through my peephole and saw Claire standing in the hallway, looking directly toward my apartment. She didn't knock. She just stood there for maybe 5 seconds, then went downstairs. I waited until I heard the building's front door close before opening mine. The paper was still on the floor. I picked it up again and noticed something I hadn't seen before. There was a faint indentation underneath the writing, like someone had written another message on the sheet before erasing it. I held it under the kitchen light and could just barely make out 2 words, 3rd floor. The next day I decided to ask Mr. Harris about the building. I found him in the basement checking the electrical panels. I showed him the note and asked if anyone else had complained about strangers entering the building. His expression changed immediately. "Where did you get that?" "Someone pushed it under my door." "Who?" "I don't know." He took the paper from me and read it twice. Then he handed it back. "If you hear anyone knocking at night, don't open the door." I stared at him. "Why?" He sighed. "There's been a problem with someone getting into the building." "Someone?" "Probably a tenant's guest. We've had trouble with people leaving the front door unlocked." "That doesn't explain the note." He didn't answer. I asked him directly whether Claire had ever complained about anything. He looked at me for a moment and then said, "Claire's been having issues with someone for a while." "What kind of issues?" "You'll have to ask her." I went upstairs and found Claire standing outside her apartment. She looked surprised to see me. I held up the note. "Did you write this?" Her face went pale. "No. Do you know who did?" She looked down the hallway before stepping closer. "Did you hear someone walking inside your apartment?" I nodded. She swallowed hard. "He's been doing that to me for months." "Who?" "I don't know." She lowered her voice. "I've called the police. I've changed my locks. I've put a chair against the door." "It doesn't matter. How is he getting inside?" "I don't know." "Then why haven't you moved?" She looked toward her apartment. "Because I don't think he's getting inside." That answer made no sense. I asked her what she meant, but she wouldn't explain. Instead, she told me something that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The apartment you're in used to be empty for almost 6 months before you moved in. Okay. During that time, I heard someone inside. I stared at her. Inside my apartment? She nodded. I heard footsteps, doors opening, cabinets. Sometimes someone would knock 3 times on the wall. Did you tell the landlord? Of course. What did he say? She looked me directly in the eyes. He said nobody was supposed to be in there. That night I barely slept. Around 1:30, I heard the familiar 3 knocks. This time I didn't move. A minute later, I heard something that made my stomach tighten. A key turning inside my front door. I sat upright in bed. The deadbolt clicked. The handle slowly moved downward. Someone was trying to open my apartment from the outside. I grabbed my phone and quietly called emergency services, then moved into the bathroom and locked the door. I could hear the front door opening. Slow footsteps crossed the living room. Whoever it was didn't rush. They walked as though they knew the layout. I heard a cabinet open. Then another. Then silence. I was about to speak into my phone when I heard 3 soft knocks against the bathroom door. Knock, knock, knock. I stopped breathing. The person on the other side of the door whispered my name. Daniel? I knew that voice. It was Claire's. I stayed silent. Daniel, please open the door. I looked at the phone in my hand. The dispatcher was still connected. Then Claire whispered something that made my blood run cold. He's in your apartment. I heard another sound behind her coming from the hallway. A man's voice said very calmly, Claire, you shouldn't have told him. Then the bathroom doorknob began to turn. The doorknob stopped turning before I could decide whether to move or stay completely still. I was crouched beside the bathtub with my phone pressed against my chest, listening to the dispatcher quietly asking me to confirm my location. I couldn't answer because I was afraid that whoever was outside would hear me. For several seconds, there was nothing but the faint hum of the bathroom exhaust fan. Then I heard Claire's voice again, but this time she sounded farther away. Daniel, don't open it. A man's voice answered her from the hallway. You really don't know when to stop, do you? I heard a sharp sound like someone grabbing her arm, followed by Claire saying, Let go of me. Then there was a crash somewhere in the living room. I expected the bathroom door to open, but it never did. Instead, I heard hurried footsteps moving toward my front door. The door slammed, and the apartment became completely silent. The dispatcher asked me if the person had left. I whispered that I didn't know. She told me officers were on the way and instructed me to stay where I was. I waited in that bathroom for what felt like 20 minutes, though it was probably less than 10. Finally, there was pounding on my apartment door. Police, open the door! I didn't move until I heard the dispatcher tell me the officers had arrived. When I unlocked the bathroom and stepped out, 2 officers were standing inside my apartment. The front door was wide open. One of them immediately asked whether anyone had been hurt. I said no, then pointed toward the hallway and told them Claire had been there. They checked the apartment and found no one. One officer inspected the lock and said there were no obvious signs of forced entry. Did you give anyone a key? He asked. No, landlord? He has one. The officer looked at the other man. We'll talk to him. They went across the hall and knocked on Claire's door. There was no answer. One officer tried the handle and found it unlocked. Her apartment was empty. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her phone was charging beside it, and a half-finished cup of coffee sat near the sink. The strange part was that her bedroom looked as though she had left in a hurry. A drawer was open, clothes were scattered across the floor, and the closet door was slightly ajar. There was no sign of Claire. The officers searched the building, including the basement and stairwell, but didn't find her. They asked me to come downstairs and give a statement. I told them everything, including the notes, the footsteps, the 3 knocks, and what Claire had told me earlier. One officer, whose name was Miller, asked me whether I had actually seen the man. I said no. He asked what the man's voice sounded like. I described it as low and calm. Did he say anything specific? Miller asked. He said Claire shouldn't have told me. Miller wrote that down. Anything else? He knew my name. The officer stopped writing. You sure? He said Daniel. Miller looked at his partner. Did Claire ever tell you his name? No. Did you tell her your full name? She knew I was Daniel. I introduced myself when I moved in. He nodded. Okay. Before they left, Miller told me to stay somewhere else for the night if I could. I called a friend and spent the rest of the night on his couch. The next morning, I returned to the apartment with a locksmith and had the locks changed. I also installed a cheap camera facing the front door. For the first few days, nothing happened. Claire never returned. Mr. Harris claimed he hadn't heard from her and said the police were handling the situation. When I asked him how a stranger could have entered my apartment without breaking the lock, he became defensive. Old locks, he said. Sometimes people get copies made. Then why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't know there was a problem. I reminded him that Claire had complained about someone entering her apartment. He said she had made accusations before, but had never been able to prove anything. She thought someone was following her, he told me. Maybe she was right, I said. He didn't answer. I started sleeping at my friend's house every night. During the day, I went to work and returned to collect clothes or shower. I checked the camera constantly. Most of the footage showed nothing unusual. Tenants coming and going, deliveries, people taking out trash. One afternoon, however, I noticed something strange. At 3:12 a.m., the camera had recorded movement in front of my door. The hallway was dark, but the camera's infrared light showed a person standing directly in front of the lens. He was wearing a dark jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. He stood there for almost 40 seconds without moving. Then he reached toward my door, not the handle, but the area above it. He appeared to touch something near the doorframe before walking away. I watched the footage several times. I couldn't see his face. I sent the recording to Miller, and he asked me to save the original file. The next evening, I went back to the apartment with him. He examined the doorframe and found a tiny piece of black tape stuck underneath the molding. He peeled it away and held it between 2 fingers. This wasn't here when we checked the first time, he said. What's it for? Could be nothing? Could be what? He didn't answer. Instead, he asked whether anyone besides Mr. Harris had access to my apartment. I told him no. He asked if I'd noticed anything missing. I checked my belongings. Nothing seemed to be gone. Then I noticed something on my desk. A small photograph I'd kept inside a drawer was sitting beside my laptop. It was a picture of my sister and me from years earlier. I knew I'd put it inside the drawer when I moved in. I hadn't taken it out since. Miller stared at it for a few seconds. Was this always here? No, he took a photograph of it and told me not to touch it. That was when the situation stopped feeling like random harassment. Someone had been inside my apartment while I was away. Someone had looked through my things. Someone had moved a photograph that had no value to anyone except me. I asked Miller what he thought was happening. He said, I think somebody wants you to know they can get to you." That night, I stayed with my friend again. At around midnight, my phone rang from an unknown number. I answered but didn't speak. There was silence on the other end. Then a man said, "You should have stayed out of it." I immediately recognized the voice. It was the same man from my apartment. "Where's Claire?" I asked. He laughed quietly. "You really think she's the problem?" Then the call ended. I reported it, but there wasn't much the police could do because the number was blocked. The next morning, Miller called me and asked me to meet him at the station. He had found something. They had reviewed older reports involving Claire and discovered that she'd made complaints about someone entering her apartment for almost a year. But there was more. 3 months before I moved in, another tenant on the second floor had reported hearing footsteps inside the vacant apartment next to mine. The tenant had called the landlord, who entered the apartment and claimed he found nothing. The report was closed. 2 months later, the same tenant moved out without giving a reason. "What was his name?" I asked. Miller told me. I searched the name online and found almost nothing, except an old social media profile with one public photograph. The man looked familiar. He was standing outside the apartment building. I stared at the picture for several seconds before realizing why. He was Mr. Harris's son. I called Miller immediately. He told me they already knew. Apparently, Mr. Harris had a son named Ryan who had been living in another state, at least according to the landlord. Ryan had a history of arrests for trespassing and stalking, but nothing that had resulted in a long prison sentence. The police had tried contacting him, but the number they had was disconnected. I asked whether he could have a key to the building. Miller said they were looking into it. That afternoon, I went back to my apartment for the last time. I had already decided to break my lease and move somewhere else. While packing, I noticed something underneath my bed. It was a small plastic storage box that hadn't been there before. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Some were of Claire leaving the building. Some showed her sitting on a bench outside work. Some showed her entering grocery stores. One showed her standing in the hallway outside my apartment. The date on the photograph was 2 weeks before I moved in. I kept looking. There were photographs of other tenants, too. Some were old, some recent. Then I found one that made my hands start shaking. It showed me carrying my first box into the building on moving day. The photograph had been taken from across the street. I had been watched before I even knew this person existed. Beneath the photographs was a folded piece of paper. I opened it and found a handwritten sentence. "Claire was never supposed to tell you about the room." I immediately called Miller. He told me not to touch anything else and said officers were coming. Before they arrived, I heard a noise from inside the wall behind my bedroom. It sounded like something metallic dropping onto the floor. I stepped back and stared at the wall. Then came 3 knocks. Knock, knock, knock. They weren't coming from the hallway. They were coming from inside my apartment wall. Miller arrived less than 10 minutes later with another officer. They inspected the wall and discovered a section of old paneling behind my closet that didn't match the rest. When they removed it, there was a narrow, unfinished space between the walls, barely wide enough for a person to crawl through. Inside were old food wrappers, empty water bottles, cigarette butts, and a blanket. There was also a small folding chair positioned directly behind my bedroom wall. Someone had been sitting there. Someone had been listening to me sleep. The officers searched the crawl space and found an opening that led toward the neighboring apartment. Miller looked at me and said, "This isn't just your apartment." We followed the space toward the end of the wall, where we found another opening hidden behind a removable vent inside Claire's closet. but Claire wasn't there. Instead, we found her purse, her phone, and a handwritten list of apartment numbers. Mine was at the top. The second number on the list belonged to an apartment on the 4th floor. The third belonged to an apartment on the 1st floor. Miller asked me if I knew any of those tenants. I didn't. Then he turned the paper over. On the back was another list, written in a different handwriting. At the bottom, underneath several names, was a final entry that hadn't been crossed out yet. It said, Daniel 3, move date, October 12th, room access confirmed. Miller stared at the page. Then his radio crackled. An officer downstairs had just found something in the building's basement. A hidden door had been opened and someone had been inside recently. Miller looked at me and said, Stay here. But before he could leave, we heard footsteps above us. Slow footsteps crossing the 4th floor hallway. Then 3 knocks echoed through the ceiling directly above my head. Knock, 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 and from somewhere inside the walls, a man's voice quietly said, Daniel, you weren't supposed to find that. The voice came from somewhere above us, but the ceiling made it impossible to tell exactly where. Miller immediately raised his hand and motioned for me to stay behind him. His partner drew his weapon and moved toward the bedroom while Miller stepped into the hallway. We heard another set of footsteps, this time coming from the staircase. Someone was moving quickly down from the 4th floor. Police! Miller shouted. Stop where you are! The footsteps stopped. For several seconds, the entire building was silent. Then we heard the unmistakable sound of a door slamming on the 4th floor. Miller and the other officer ran upstairs. I stayed inside my apartment, staring at the exposed section of wall and trying to understand how someone could have been living inside the building without anyone noticing. The crawl space was filthy, narrow, and barely ventilated. Whoever had been using it had known exactly where the openings were and how to move between apartments without being seen. A few minutes later, I heard Miller shouting from upstairs. Then there was a loud crash. I stepped into the hallway despite his instructions and looked toward the staircase. His partner came running down. Get back inside, he yelled. Now. I did. Less than a minute later, Miller appeared at the top of the stairs with another man in handcuffs. He was thin, wearing a gray sweatshirt and baseball cap. I couldn't see his face clearly until they brought him downstairs. It was Ryan Harris, the landlord's son. I recognized him immediately from the photograph I'd found online. He looked at me and smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an angry one. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they've finally been caught after spending a long time wondering whether they ever would be. You shouldn't have listened to Claire, he said. Miller pushed him forward. Keep walking. Ryan laughed quietly. She always makes things worse. They took him outside and another officer arrived to search the building. I thought that was the end of it. I thought we'd finally found the person responsible for everything. But there was one thing that didn't make sense. Claire was still missing. Ryan had been found inside the building, but there was no evidence that he'd been the person who had taken her. The police searched every apartment, the basement, the roof, and the surrounding streets. They found more hidden access points inside the walls. Several cameras, spare keys, and boxes containing photographs of tenants. They also found a second crawl space beneath the basement stairs. Inside was a mattress, bottled water, canned food, and a small portable radio. It looked like someone had been staying there recently. Miller told me Ryan admitted to entering apartments without permission, but he refused to explain where Claire was. He kept saying she had left on her own. I didn't believe him. Neither did the police. The landlord, Mr. Harris, was questioned for several hours. He claimed he had no idea what his son had been doing. But when officers searched his office, they found a ring containing duplicates of almost every apartment key in the building. Mr. Harris insisted he'd kept them for emergencies. The police weren't convinced. He was eventually charged with several offenses related to the unauthorized access, while Ryan faced much more serious charges because of the stalking, break-ins, and evidence found inside the building. I moved out 3 days later. I didn't even finish packing everything. I left furniture behind, threw away things I didn't want to touch again, and stayed with a friend until I found another place. The police kept my photograph and the notes as evidence. For the next several weeks, I heard nothing about Claire. I called Miller twice, but he couldn't give me much information because the investigation was ongoing. Then, one afternoon, almost a month after I moved out, I received a voicemail from an unknown number. I almost deleted it without listening. Then I heard Claire's voice. "Daniel, if you get this, don't call the police." "I need you to listen?" She sounded exhausted and frightened. She said she had been staying with a relative and had been afraid to contact anyone because she didn't know who she could trust. She told me Ryan wasn't the only person involved. There was someone else, she said. Someone who knew everything Ryan was doing. The voicemail ended before she could say, "Who?" I immediately contacted Miller anyway. He told me Claire had been located several days earlier and was safe, but they hadn't released that information publicly. He asked me where I'd gotten the voicemail. I sent it to him. He called me back less than an hour later. "Daniel, that voicemail wasn't recorded recently." "What do you mean?" "The metadata says it was recorded 3 weeks ago." I looked at the date. That was before Claire had supposedly been found. Miller wouldn't explain further. 2 days later, he called again and asked me to come to the station. He played me a recording. It was audio recovered from a hidden device inside my old apartment. The recording had captured conversations from the crawl space. Most of it was unintelligible, but one section was clear. Ryan's voice said, "He moved into 3A. Another voice answered, "Then we'll know if she told him." Ryan asked, "What if she did?" The second person said, "Then make sure he doesn't leave." I recognized the second voice immediately. It was Mr. Harris. I couldn't believe it. The landlord had known. Maybe he'd been helping his son. Maybe he'd been using the building to monitor tenants for years. The police discovered that several tenants had been watched without their knowledge. They found cameras hidden inside smoke detectors, vents, and electrical outlets. Some of the recordings went back years, but there was something else. The recordings showed that Claire had discovered one of the cameras months before I moved in. She had confronted Mr. Harris, and after that, someone began following her. That's why she'd been afraid. That's why she warned me about the noises. She wasn't imagining anything. She had been living in a building where someone had access to the walls, the keys, and private information about nearly everyone who lived there. The police eventually arrested Mr. Harris on multiple charges, and Ryan was prosecuted separately. Claire testified. Several former tenants came forward after hearing about the investigation. One of them told police she'd once woken up to find a man standing in her bedroom doorway. Another had found personal photographs moved around her apartment. A third had discovered a small hole behind a vent that looked directly into her bedroom. It had been happening for years. What frightened me most was realizing how ordinary everything had seemed. The landlord had smiled when I signed the lease. The hallway had always looked harmless. Claire had simply seemed like a quiet neighbor. Even the noises had sounded like normal apartment noises until I knew what was actually happening behind the walls. About 6 months after I moved out, I received a letter from the property management company. The building had been sold, and the new owners were renovating it completely. I almost threw the letter away, but one sentence caught my attention. It said that during demolition, workers had discovered additional concealed spaces between the apartments. I contacted Miller and asked what that meant. He told me they had found another room. This one was larger than the crawl spaces we'd already seen. It was located behind the fourth-floor apartments and contained shelves filled with boxes. Inside the boxes were personal belongings from former tenants: watches, letters, keys, photographs, spare clothing, even old birthday cards. Some items were decades old. The worst part was that nobody could determine who had originally built the room. The building was over 60 years old, and some of the modifications appeared to have been made long before Mr. Harris owned it. Miller told me that investigators were still trying to determine whether the surveillance had started with him or whether he'd simply continued something that had already existed. I didn't know what to think. Then, one evening nearly a year after I moved away, I received one final package. There was no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the hallway outside my old apartment. The picture had been taken from the end of the corridor. My apartment door was visible in the background. The photograph was dated 3 days after I had moved out. I knew because the timestamp was printed along the bottom. I looked closely at the image and noticed something standing near my old door. A man. He was mostly hidden in shadow, but I could see his face clearly enough. It wasn't Ryan. It wasn't Mr. Harris. It wasn't anyone I recognized. On the back of the photograph was a handwritten message. "You were lucky." I called Miller immediately. He told me to keep the photograph and not contact anyone. Then he asked me a question I still think about. "Did you ever tell anyone where you moved?" I said no. He was quiet for several seconds. "Are you sure?" "Yes." He told me investigators had reviewed the photograph and believed it had been taken after the building was already under police surveillance. Whoever had taken it had known exactly where I was living before I moved. They searched the old building again but found nothing. No cameras. No hidden room. No fingerprints they could use. Eventually, the investigation was closed. Ryan was convicted. Mr. Harris was convicted too. Claire moved away and I never spoke to her again. I changed my phone number, moved twice, and became much more careful about what information I shared with people. For a long time, I couldn't sleep without checking the door several times. I kept thinking about the 3 knocks. 3 quiet knocks in the middle of the night. Something I once believed was just an old building settling had actually been a signal from someone standing on the other side of my door. Sometimes I still think about that apartment. Not because I miss it, but because of how easily someone can hide in plain sight. You can live next to someone for years without knowing anything about them. You can pass them in a hallway, hold the elevator for them, hear them unlocking their door, and assume they're just another person trying to get through the day. The part that still bothers me most isn't that someone had been watching me. It's that I never noticed when it started. I don't know if Ryan chose my apartment because I was new, or if someone had been monitoring the empty apartment before I moved in and simply waited for another tenant. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I'll hear a random noise from somewhere inside the walls of my current apartment. A pipe, a heater, a settling floorboard. I always stop and listen. And every once in a while, when the building is completely silent, I swear I can hear 3 faint knocks coming from somewhere behind the wall. I never investigate them. I don't care what they are. Because the last time I heard 3 knocks, I opened my door, and the person standing on the other side already knew my name.